as soon as about an hour after the webinar is over. Please return that. It will come in a follow-up email, and once you do that, you will get a link to the follow-up. So without any more to do, I'm going to go forward with today's presentation on ethics. Okay, so a little bit about TAASA. We're a statewide organization. We do trainings and public policy and prevention work, and we support advocates because we believe that we respect the fundamental rights and dignity of all. I also want to say that this presentation is put together by use of other folks. I have cited my sources, and if you want to cite them, that is fine. Please cite them. Just don't refer them back to me because I am not the original source. Okay, so I'm going to ask, can everybody hear? Can everybody see? Everybody see the screen? Can you chat it in? Can everybody see? Can everybody hear? Okay, so the next thing I'm going to ask you is, what's your definition of ethics? Okay. Yes and yes. Thank you. What's your definition of ethics? What do you think ethics is? Okay, let's go down and see. Okay, well, how about this? That ethics is basically a philosophy. You can even get a degree in it if you go to college. You can get a PhD in it, of how we ought to live. And the ought is really important there. Because it's philosophical, that means that there's no right or wrong answers. What's important about ethics is to be aware of what your organization requires of you. It is about moral standards, and that is true, but it is also about what your ethics is, what your organization would require of you, and knowing what your ethicals are. And is there a clash between the two of them? Because if there is, if you're doing something unethical, quote unquote, according to the organization, you are leaving yourself and your agency, you're leaving that door wide open for all sorts of scrutinies, possible lawsuits, and many people, including you, may get hurt, may lose your jobs, and it is not necessarily a kind situation going on. Okay, so I want to talk about what this is. There are two different definitions here, yet they are similar. It's the study of ethics, is that it's looking at behaviors and practices conducted, responding to situations and looking at right or wrong answers. It's more about what I should do in this situation and not about what is right or wrong, but what I should do. That's a little tweak on it, because if you think about what you should do, and then you go and you ask your supervisor or clinical supervisor or one of your fellow advocates, what do you think they might say? Or a friend, do you think it would be the absolute same what they should do? So when we talk about being a system of moral values, whose moral values are we talking about? Where do you get your moral strength from? Is that where I would necessarily get my moral strength from? So when we're talking about ethical integrity, where does your moral strength come from? And is everybody's moral strength based on that same ethical integrity? I'm going to address that a little bit further down the line. And when we talk about professional ethics, we're talking about a professional code of ethics. What constitutes excellence in the field? Which field? Do you think firefighters have the same ethical excellence as a brain surgeon? They're very different. So we need to look at this from all points of view and decide for ourselves, what does that mean when we are working with victims, okay? So ethical rules. If there is not one consistent set of standards, an agency has a right to develop the standards that are meaningful for their organization. What are we talking about here? What does it mean to have ethical standards? And if has the right, each agency has the right to create ethical standards. Does this kind of begin to look like prevention? Because what flies in Austin is not necessarily going to fly in Abilene, which is not necessarily going to fly in Brownsville. What are we talking about? And if I'm making your brain hurt here, that's exactly my intention. Okay, so this is the National Association of Social Workers. These are their ethical, they serve 6 purposes. This is what they are, their 6 core principles, according to them, and this was revised in 2017. And you can read them for yourselves because I think they're important. But I also think that what is also important, that the values that we talk about, these are the core values. I think they are more important because they have to align your organization and the agency that licenses you. So let's talk about that. That the social worker's primary goal is to help people, or the advocate's goal, and to address social problems. What are they talking about here? And how would you define this for yourself? I'm just asking you to do that for yourself. I'm not saying that you have to do that right now, but what the service is, when we're talking about service, what we have here is, how do you draw on your knowledge and values and skills? Because I can tell you quite frankly that when I started, my knowledge, my values, and my skills about how to help people and to address social problems were more limited than they are now. Because I've been in this field for a long time, it has continued to grow. They say volunteer some portion of your professional skills. How do you volunteer? How do you do pro bono work? I'm telling you that when I was doing direct services, there was no way that I wanted to get off work and then do pro bono work, the same work that I was doing in my profession. So one of the things that I thought through for myself was to go work at a soup kitchen, because it, that was a way for me to give back in a way that felt like I was not doing work. It felt like it was something that I wanted to do that genuinely came from my heart. And that's what I'm thinking. And when the soup kitchen didn't do it for me anymore, being able to tutor kids on how to read, or reading at the library, I'm just suggesting ways of giving back where service is needed, but it's not going to be a huge chunk of time, and where you're going to look at the problems, quote unquote, that we work with every day in a very different perspective. Okay, we talk about social justice, and how they define is the challenge of social justice. We advocates are supposed to challenge it. So how would you define for you social injustice? And that's a change, and the change has to focus from past. What we have to do is to look at what we're talking about. What does discrimination look like in the here and now? Once upon a time, we kept our focus on voting rights and poverty and housing rights. And I'm not saying that that has been eliminated in our society. Times have changed, and what has changed with the times? And if so, are there older injustices that still need to be resolved, and newer injustices that need to be looked at? All right, dignity and worth. What is the inherent dignity and worth of a person? All right, how do we resolve conflicts? between the client's interest and the interest of the broader society. Okay, how does that work for us? How do we do that in a socially responsible manner, consistent with the standards of our profession and the values and the ethical principles of the people who we work for the survivors? How does this work for us and for our clients? Because part of this double-edged sword is that we put the client's interest first. How does that get done? And I'm going to say something here. We have to know our systems of where we work, not just the organization that we work for, but also the organizations that we work with, well enough to know that if we are going to break something or work outside of the boundaries, what the boundaries are and how they can be worked and what the potential consequences may be and the unintended consequences may be before we even go there. And that is part of our deeper learning as advocates. Okay, so the importance of human relationships, that it is central in any relationship that we establish a relationship with not only the survivors, but also with the networking opportunities and other organizations, all of it as vehicles for creating change. We are creating change differently inside of organizations, and yet that is okay. So, because we want to enhance the well-being of everybody who lives in the community. Okay, integrity. What is integrity made of? Think about that. What is integrity made of? You know, is it honesty? Is it fairness? Is it your qualifications? Is it somebody else's definition of fairness or integrity? How do you avoid denial of a relationship to fulfill your commitment to your professional role? Is that fair? I mean, how do we bust our denials? How do we stay out of dual relationships? How do we think that through? How do we have respect for a survivor's personal history and belief system, as well as our own personal history and belief system? How do we see things from another point of view and yet show that or enable a survivor to see that as well? And how do we move forward? Because it's going to affect all of our interactions. Our point of view, their point of view, and their being the survivors, other agencies, other systems that have huge, huge, huge differences in them. Okay. So we need to talk about competence. And competence is that we are constantly expanding our knowledge base. You know, we're constantly doing formal learning and on-the-job experience. That's one of the ways that we learn. And this means not just performing our job duties in accordance with the laws and the regulations and the policies and the legislative rights of the people we serve. It also means making appropriate use of other professional resources in the community, knowing who they are and what's going there. I want you all to please remember that your ability to serve your survivors effectively depends upon your own wellness. And if we don't take care of ourselves, we are not by any way, shape, or form going to be able to take care of our clients or survivors. So I want you to think about, what do these 6 core values have in common? What do you think they have in common? And again, you can type it in if you want, or you can think about it. But they're all very well defined, and they're all about other focus. They're outside of yourself. So if you are going to work in this field, how are you going to define these core values that you have your own personal core values with that of those in the field. All right. Okay, so we're talking about ethical standards, and ethical standards are more than words, they are about actions, and they're helpful with dealing in gray areas and helpful for avoiding dual roles and respect for both the advocates and the survivors. And that is incredibly important, and it is a never-ending process because we are constantly learning and constantly growing. Okay, I want you to keep in mind that ethics are fluid. How you work with one agency will be different from another agency, and how y'all work together will be different still. I want to give you an example. Part of usually any community service organization is going to include the words ethics. The Austin Police Department, it has to keep its officers cognizant of what their mission statement is I care. And the I is integrity, but integrity to police practices. And at the very end, ethics. Ethics is, it comes at the very end. You're supposed to do the I first and the care. You have the integrity to the community and action. So you're seeing different focuses, yet we all have to work together. So they don't usually reveal easy or quick or exact answers. Okay? So I want you to think about this. Not all truths are based on the same facts, and not all facts equal the same truths. This is confusing. Survivors have the most informed perspective regarding their personal history, victimization, risks, and they are the ultimate authority on their interests. If the advocate's perception of what is best for them is is best for the survivor is at odds with the survivors, well, the advocate can deeply disagree with the survivor's proposed course of action or non-action, and the advocate can point out why they believe that way. The ethical response is to provide as much information as possible so the survivor can make a fully informed choice. And what we're talking about here is fully informed choices. That's what we're doing when we say that it is victim-centered that we are taking care of, what we want. So this is also about a cultural frame, and it is about how you interpret events, how each of us interpret, respond, and assign meaning to things that have happened. And it's based on whatever we've observed and made meaning out of, interpreted what we observed based on past experiences, and made a conclusion which is about a reflects a self-interest. Understanding this and sharing this with survivors can help with some of those dual roles, but also places where we have a different view of what is ethical or isn't. Because if we all make fundamentally different meanings of the world, until we address and understand our differences and attempts to improve communication, is going to fail. And it's going to fail because we're going to be saying things in a very different way. We're going to be using terms and cues that have different meanings for folks, especially for folks whose English is their second language. They're going, or making direct translations of stuff. All right. So we talk about cultural relativism, and that is a branch of ethics that says that all moral judgments are culturally based. So what's right or wrong depends upon a society's norms. Do you think that's true? Because if that's true, then somebody who we would view as elderly, as 65 or up, is going to make way different meanings of the world than a teenager today. And both views are right. And if we're going to work with someone ethically, we have got to understand both points of views and where they're coming from. I'm just asking you to look at that and to think about that, because it can get very, very confusing. There's no, for ethical relevance, there's no universal moral standards. And that's what I want you to think about. For most ethicists, what they do is they say that that is not true, that there are common fundamental moral principles that underlie all societies, like killing is wrong, all right? And they also recognize the need to examine a culture's differences in morality before coming to an agreement on an ethical behavior. And so that's really important to understand that, because it's not what we think. It is about what collectively, how we are going to help a survivor move forward. Um, because if we don't, like I said before, vocabulary is going to get in the way. So is cultural significance. So is religious orientation. They're going to be, I'm going to take an example here, and I'm going to use myself. At one point, I was doing chemical dependency counseling inside of an organization, and all the addicted survivors who were there were extremely religious. And every time I brought up a point, they threw out a verse from the Bible. And you know what that forced me to do? And I'm grateful to it to this day. It forced me to look it up, view it in context, understand it. It gave me a much deeper and richer understanding of the Bible and the Bible section that they were doing and the stories that they were telling me by using those references and being helping them to walk through and understand that some things in the Bible were written in the there and then, and how is it applicable today? And it broadened me as a counselor, and it broadened them as survivors. And I think that that is really, really important. So I'm going to give you a quick case study here. Lisa's a 17-year-old immigrant who lives with her father, two younger sisters, and some uncles. They suffered greatly in their country of origin, and Lisa feels it is her duty as the oldest daughter to keep the family together at all costs. About 3 months ago, Lisa started coming to a group at the teen center and has never spoken. Today, she discloses to you that one of her uncles is molesting her, and she is afraid he will molest her sisters. You would like Lisa to reveal who is harming her. No one in the family has, quote, papers, and Lisa's terrified that an official report will trigger deportation and turn the whole family against her. What is your reaction when you heard this scenario, and what are the underlying thoughts that jumped out at you or that you were aware of? What jumped out of you, and what would you do in this case? I'm just asking you. When this actually happened to one of my professional peers out in Los Angeles, this is what she did. She was from the same community and the same culture of Lisa. She understood that if Lisa reported, she would be excommunicated, and that wasn't going to happen. She also knew that Lisa is 17 years old, and in the state in which she lived in, 18 was the age of majority. She knew she had to make a report. She knew that Lisa's younger sisters were also probably being abused, and her commitment first lied in getting the safety of Lisa out of the house along with her younger sisters. And in this community, they found an auntie who was distantly related to them, who was elder, who needed the care of these young girls to come and help and clean the house and etc. And once she was able to engineer that, my friend then disclosed to her clinical supervisor what had happened. Then they made the report because it was mandated. She knew the girls were safe. To make a very long story short, my friend lost her license. Her license was suspended for a while, and she understood that that was probably going to happen. She was okay with that because she felt her duty was to be safe. So I want you to think about that as you move forward and what you would have done. We've done cases like this where you can stand up or sit down or stay seated if you are religious, and you go through all these things. You are religious, you've been married more than once, you are conservative, you're younger, and it's like, how does it feel to find yourself characterized without an opportunity to explain your ambivalences or contradictions or experiences? How does it feel to say that, yes, you struck another human being and it was in self-defense? But the phrase is, you've never struck another human being. What if you have a member who is GLBTQ and they're not out yet, and you stand up, and especially if you live in a rural community, you've outed them? How does that feel? What if you marched in a political rally and yet you don't want anyone to know because everyone in your family is the exact opposite of your politics? How does it feel to say that you've been married more than once, especially if you've been married and your partner died due to some kind of horrific event and not because of divorce, and yet you get labeled and stuck there? So forced to make an either or choice, especially, we've got to be aware of that, especially when we are working with our survivors who are also traumatized. And that is so important for us to realize that and not place labels on there, because we need to understand how our own personal history affects our ability to work with clients, and to understand what our biases and values on sex and power and gender orientation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, means while we are definitely going forward and moving. Because if we get stuck somewhere, maybe it's better to say, to go to talk to our clinical supervisors and say, I'm getting stuck here. I have a horrible time and a horrible bias against this. I want to talk briefly about coercion, because coercion is often the legal use of words and implied actions that make a person do something, and it's about wearing down their resistance. And so when we ask and work with our survivors, if they see us in a one-up position from them, as in we are meet the new boss same as the old boss, they are going to start talking about what is going on, what is happening here. And it's those invisible chains that bind us, and it is incumbent upon all advocates to say or do something to address that. I want to talk briefly about oppression, because this is what I call cultural imperialism, that we talk as if everybody understands us. And that is great when we are talking with our peers. It's not so great when we are not. The fact is that it is our job to understand our clients. So oppression is the idea that a group or a person is superior and has the right to control other, and it shows up in our personal values, our interpersonal values, institutional rules and policies, culture, internalized oppression. But what I am going to tell you more is that when you talk about them or they, those people, we've already internalized some kind of oppression, and it gets ugly even if we are not consciously, we're not conscious of it. Because most people in the dominant group are not consciously oppressive. It's just that they have been about, we're using words that have, quote, been normalized, and that is the danger of oppression. All right. So microaggression, you people, those people, micro insults, not willing to learn the pronunciation of a non-English based name, or micro invalidations. Like as a woman, I've gone through oppression myself, so I know what you people must feel like as a minority. Really? That is extremely rude. Have you ever been the recipient of a microaggression or a micro insult or a micro invalidation? Think about that. How did it make you feel? Did you ever hear when you were growing up that this is not a profession for women? Something along those lines. You can't do that because you're a man. You can only be a nurse if you're a woman. That's what it is. Okay, so why should counselors be ethical? First off, who are we there to represent? It is always the survivor. It is always the client. And being ethical is going to improve their experience. It's going to improve the credibility of the organization. It avoids bad publicity and it provides consistency. As my mentor in this field told me many, many years ago, the only thing that advocates in this field have is their reputation. And once you sully your reputation, you will never get another job in this field, because this field, we speak. Okay. So this would not be an ethics presentation if we did not talk about confidentiality versus privilege. In Texas, these are the Texas Rules of Evidence, Article 5, Rules 501 to 513, and this is how it is defined legally. A confidential communication is one that is not intended to be disclosed to a third party, but it can be disclosed in court. All right. A privileged communication is one that does not have to be disclosed, even in a court of law or any legal proceedings. In Texas at this time, sexual assault advocates do not have privilege. They have, confidentiality. The family violence advocates do have privileged communication in Texas. They do not have to disclose in a court of law. What happens if you work for an agency that is only sexual assault focused? That's all you do. You're an RCC, a rape crisis center. What do you do if you are just a family violence center? And what do you do if you are a dual agency, that you work with not only sexual assault survivors, but also family violence survivors? This is something that agency by agency you need to figure out what you can do legally to protect the information of all survivors. I love this quote. I use it all the time because Detective Lumley and I, he is now retired, we would get into it because we would argue. And I said to him one day, I said, John, I don't understand what the hell is wrong with you. We are all on the same page. He got very quiet and thought about it for a moment. And he said, no, Wendy, we are not. We are all chapters in the same novel. And I was so mad I couldn't hear the message in that for a minute. And I had to calm down. And he said, we want the same outcomes. We further the story along in different ways. And that was the best way that I was able to understand my ethical responsibilities and let go of it. Because systems-based organizations think of community-based organizations very differently. In community-based, which is our nonprofits, system-based organizations think we play Ring Around the Rosie, or that we make a big circle and sing Kumbaya, and we're touchy-feely and new agey. We're not, but that's what they think we are. And community-based also have their ideas about what it's like to work with systems-based. They're slow. they're all bureaucracies. They move slowly. They don't understand what's going on, and on and on and on. So what I want to say to us, all of us, is that both community-based and systems-based provide supportive services for the people that we serve, for the survivors. And we provide them in slightly different ways. They are complementary. They're not exactly contradictory. So it is important to understand, and this is in the handout, so I'm not going to go over it completely, but it is important for us to understand who our counterpart is with all the agencies that we work with, both community-based and systems-based, so that we can better serve the client. Okay? I want to talk about another case study. You have worked with one of your clients, Marion, for some time. She has finally set out on her own and periodically calls you to check in and let you know how she's doing. One day, Marion calls just before you get off work, and she is crying. Her babysitter called saying she will be an hour late, and Marion, still crying, says she has to be at work on time or she will lose her job. She also says she lives nearby, and can you please, 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 please come by on your way home and stay with her children long enough for the babysitter to get there. If you can't, she is going to leave the children alone until the sitter can get here. And you know that her kids are 8, 6, and 4. What are the issues here? What do you do? What do you do if you do not like Marion particularly and you have worked with her? What do you do if you really like Marion? What stands out for you here? For me, and in the interest of time, I want to say that what stood out for me the first time I saw this was that how come Marion knew the schedule of this particular advocate? What's going on here? Okay, that was my first thing. She's crying. And in my world, sometimes crying when I can't see somebody means a little bit of manipulation, especially since she said she will lose her job if she does not get there on time. How many times has she been late before? Did she pick up the phone and call her boss? And number two is she's going to leave her kids alone. There are 8, 6, and 4. Are you a mandated reporter? That was my first thing. So this was my segue into talking about boundaries. Know where you begin and the client ends. Know how your personal history affects all this, because this is not a good situation. I don't believe that my job at this point in time with Marion is to go over and babysit, even though everything in my heart of hearts does not want those babies to be left alone. To remind Marion I am a mandated reporter, to help Marion problem solve, to do a number of things that you can do, because professional boundaries are what protect victims from exploitation. You know what? It also, I love this solution. I can't see who wrote it, but that she could bring her children to work, to the work, because to your center, I'm guessing, because you provide advocacy there. I love that, Elise. That is great. Or services until the sitter can pick the kids up, or calling her neighbor, whatever it is, to help problem solve. Because if this is the time where Marion calls, what is she going to call for next? That begins to create that dual relationship that we need to stay away from. We need to stay objective. When I find that my heart was going out to Marion, I already knew I was not being objective anymore. Those are the things that we need to be careful about when we are talking about the abuse of power and client vulnerability. Okay. I love that they can bring the kids, and I don't know who has that or doesn't, but I think that is great. Okay, because in my ethical system, operating ethical system, trauma-informed care equals ethical practices. Knowing that people are going to have meltdowns over everything, they get triggered, they can't, survivors can't think through stuff. Calling is a good first step, and allowing for the survivor to define their experience in their own words means that it's going to be their safety that we're talking about, their solution to the problem. And what this has to do with ethic means that you continue to be safe and trustworthy, and you're going to promote choices for the survivor. And we're not going to take that away from them, which is really, really, really important. And safety is not just about physical safety, it's also being that advocates are going to ensure emotional and psychological safety. That's so important for survivors, and that we're going to maintain appropriate boundaries and keep making that clear that that is a boundary violation, not necessarily in those words. I can't do that in my job. I can help you think this through. What needs, let's take a breath. Let's get a glass of water. Let's think this through. Let's see what choices are there so that the survivor is the person making their choices, because having small choices and making them is huge. And maybe next time when Marion finds herself in this situation, she will not necessarily call you. So what I have to say here is that I believe that the social workers, the advocates' ethical responsibility is commitment to clients and the self-determination of clients. Because this is, we promote the well-being. And this is a double-edged sword. It's, if we are going to commit to the well-being of clients, we also have to commit to our own well-being. We have to define for ourselves what well-being looks like for us, and then commit to doing that. Because if I come home night after night thinking about, exhausted, and doing nothing to take care of myself, this number one commitment to clients is not going to work. And we have to promote and respect the rights of our survivors for self-determination. We also have to do that for ourselves as advocates, because if we don't, and we don't where our boundaries are, where a client begins and my job ends, we are going to again do some disservice to our survivors, and we're going to muddy the waters. We can't misrepresent our advocacy, our agency, and our responsibilities inside of the organization. And I'm going to give you specific examples. If you are a licensed counselor and you are working the hotline, it is not your job to do counseling over the phone on a hotline call. You are there to do hotline work as defined by your agency. If someone calls you and you are their caseworker, their counselor, their advocate, and they're asking a legal question, it is not your job to answer any legal questions, because that is acting in the role of an attorney, and that is totally incorrect. The only time that I answer any kind of legal questions are very general, broad legal questions that you can go to your Google machine and it can define it for you. As in who is, what is the legal age in your state? Okay, what is the legal age? And that you can find out by Googling it. Okay, someone is unmuted, so please make sure that y'all are muted. Okay, But to find that out, if somebody says to me, the law says shall, I mean that I know that there's no wiggle room, because I can go to the internet and find out that shall and will have different meanings legally. And that is fine with me to say that, but those are the only two questions that I will answer. All right, anything that can be found online is something that I will answer, but the referral is always to an attorney, especially in civil cases and more particularly in criminal cases. Okay, so what this all means is that we have to shift our views. Who gets to define safety and who gets to define justice? What is helpful? How are suggestions for services made? How is resilience made? How do we understand trauma? And how do we hold the larger context of violence and oppression in our everyday to-day work? How does that work for us? And once we have defined that for ourselves and we understand how our agencies defines it, do they mesh? Do they work well? How do we define and ask the same questions of our survivors, and explain how we can work together to move the survivor forward to do ethically, work with them to make the choices that they need to make in order to survive. Okay, so I believe that professional behavior of victim service personnel means ethics and self-awareness, which we talked about, boundaries and understanding what dual relationships is. Boundaries also and prejudgments, I believe, are also informed consent needs to be in there, and confidentiality when we talk about these first three, the ethics, the self-awareness, the boundaries, and the prejudgments. Understanding what individual rights versus the good of the community means, because that is so very important. Okay, spirituality, and I'm not talking religion here, but spirituality and what that means for the survivor and what that means to you. Okay, yes, Melanie, this is being recorded. The handouts will come in the follow-up email, where your moral orientation is, and understand that your moral orientation is just fine for you, and it may not be just fine for anyone else. To understand yours and the others. The other is the difference between legal advocacy and legal advice, very important. And I also want us to understand that the voice of justice and the voice of caring are two different things. We can have competing priorities here, personal versus professional, conflict of interest. We need to be aware of multicultural humility, who lives in our communities. We need to understand, if we're working in smaller or in rural communities, what that means in terms of ethics, what you are doing. And all of that together weaves what we do, how we as advocates, what we do and how we do it. I'll be on the line for a little bit. Here's some recommended reading that I have. If you have questions, please chat them in. These are the resources that I use. Thank you. And again, I'm here for a little bit. So if you want to chat in a question, happy to answer it. At the same time, I am in an hour, you will receive a follow-up email with the handout. The recording of this will go online within TAASA's YouTube channel within 10 business days. I appreciate y'all being here today, and thank you.